Hello world, my name is David Malan, and last time we implemented the internet, today we're going to weave a web on top of it. That is to say, the World Wide Web, or web for short, is really just a service that takes for granted that there is an infrastructure like the internet that can get data from point A to point B. But what we're going to focus on today is exactly what that data is that's traveling between web browsers and web servers. Now, you can think of that process as being akin to sending an old school letter in the mail. On the outside of the envelope, you might put, in the technology world, the IP address of the recipient, as well as a TCP port number that specifies the service that you're requesting, perhaps 80 or 443 for the web. And you might even have some kind of sequence number that allows the receiving server to keep track of just how many packets you intended to send and whether it's received all of those. Meanwhile, on the inside of this envelope can be any number of messages, but when we're talking about the web, it's going to follow a specific format. Recall that web browsers and web servers speak a protocol, a convention called HTTP, Hypertext Transfer Protocol, that essentially just governs what the messages inside of these envelopes must look like, both from the sender and from the receiver in response. So for instance, inside of the sender's envelope might be a message like this: get /, which indicates the root of or the default folder in a web server, the following using the protocol HTTP version 2. Specifically, get that from www.newyorktimes.com in this particular case. Now, if the New York Times web server were to receive a message like this, it would then prepare an envelope of its own, ideally containing all of the day's news, its homepage, so to speak, and send that back to the original sender, that is your or my browser. What's inside of that envelope? Well, a message that's even more arcane that looks a little something like this: an acknowledgement that the protocol in use is indeed HTTP version 2, some kind of status code, which ideally indicates that everything is OK, as the 200 here does, maybe the date and time of the server, just so that you can keep track of when this message was sent and how current it is, and then the type of content that was sent back. And in this case, and for today's entire class, text HTML. That is to say, some kind of text file, but specifically in a format known as HTML, as we'll soon see. And then thereafter is going to be the actual data that the web browser requested, namely the contents of the web page, written again in this language, HTML. Now, HTML, or hypertext markup language, is not a programming language. It's indeed a markup language, which means it's a way of structuring your data and adding metadata to it. For instance, maybe formatting information or semantic information that somehow conveys to the browser, or in turn human, what it is they're actually looking at. So what we're going to see over the course of this lecture is how you can write HTML yourself, or equivalently what it looks like, so that you can better understand what's going on between web browsers and servers. And at the end of the day, HTML is actually relatively simple. I dare say a single class on HTML is enough to certainly understand the basics of it, even though it takes time and practice to actually memorize or learn all of the various features thereof. But those features are generally categorized into one of two things: either tags or attributes. That is to say, the language HTML really only has two syntactic features: tags and attributes. And we'll see what those are going to do for us. Here is perhaps the simplest web page you can write in HTML version 5. Version 5 is indicated by this first line here, which ironically makes no mention of 5, but that's the version of the language that browsers and servers now use. And then you have a whole bunch of what are called tags, some of which may very well have what are called attributes. Now, what are these here? Well, let's highlight this line by line. This very first line of code here indicates to the browser that this is indeed a document written in the language called HTML. This is the kind of thing that you just kind of have to memorize or copy paste. It's technically known as a document type declaration, and it's just a standard string of text that indicates to the browser, the server has sent me version 5 of HTML. Below that is the actual HTML, and you'll notice some symmetry in what we have on the screen here. This, for instance, is the beginning of the first HTML element, so to speak. And we'll see what that means, whereby inside of this element are the following: the tag itself. So this is also equivalently an HTML tag. And then there's an attribute in there called lang, which has a value of en. Now, we'll see in a moment what all of these other tags and perhaps attributes do. But for now, just know that this is essentially a conversation between the file and the browser. That is to say, this first line says, hey, browser, here comes a web page written in HTML. Attributes modify the behavior of tags to give a little more information to the browser. For instance, as you might have inferred, lang, which is short for language, indicates to the browser that the language in which this web page is written is in fact en or English. Now, lang is standardized. That's an attribute that you must spell as such. You can't say language. You have to follow the specification itself, which says L-A-N-G is the attribute's spelling. The value herein is standardized too, using typically 2 or even 3 character codes that indicate what language is apt. And then below this, we'll see, is yet another tag, and so forth. But there's going to be a pattern that emerges. This says to the browser, hey, browser, here comes the head of the web page. And the head is really just the tippy top of it. It's like everything you might see in the tabs at the very top of the screen, but not much else. Meanwhile, as you might surmise, title says, hey, browser, here comes the title of the page. And then we have actual text, hello, comma, title. Now, I came up with that myself in the spirit of saying hello world all of the time. Hello title is just literally what you would see as the title of this page. In other words, if you look at the tab at the very top of the screen, odds are you would see, depending on your browser, exactly this text. Now, we have a different sort of tag. This is what we're going to call now a close tag, which corresponds to this open tag. Or if you prefer, an end tag that corresponds to this start tag. And notice the only thing different between them is the fact that the close tag or end tag begins with a / inside of the angled brackets. And the name of the tag, title in this case, is repeated verbatim. So what this effectively says is, hey, browser, that's it for the title. Meanwhile, this line says, hey, browser, that's it for the head. So this similarly closes or ends what was the start or open tag here called head. Meanwhile, here comes the body of the page quite literally. Hey, browser, here's the body of the page, which is like 95% of the page, really the so-called viewport, everything you see in the big rectangular region of the page that represents the web page itself. In this case, it's a super small web page because it's only going to have the text in that big rectangular region that says hello, comma, body. And then, as you might surmise, this tag here says, hey, browser, that's it for the body. Hey, browser, that's it for the web page itself. So HTML is a markup language in the sense that we've marked up the actual data we care about. The title of this page at the end of the day is hello, comma, title. The contents of this page at the end of the day, aka body, is hello, comma, body. And everything else are just tags and perhaps attributes that inform the browser what it is that it's looking at. You and I, as the humans, really don't care about any of this, but it provides structure to the web page so that the browser knows what to do with it. And it's no accident that the head is up here and the body is down here. That's exactly the sort of metaphor that HTML is trying to convey when painting a picture of what this web page should look like. Now, if you prefer to think about this same HTML more as a data structure, it turns out that there's a perfect correspondence between this HTML and the indentation that I very carefully adhere to just to make clear what tags are inside of which others, and this tree structure here. If you think back on our discussion of data structures, this here is a tree known as a DOM, a document object model, and it's essentially the data structure that a browser would build up in its memory or RAM upon downloading a web page that looks like this. Notice, for instance, we have a box up at the top. We'll call it generically a node for the document itself. By definition, the web page itself has just one HTML element, the so-called root element of the document. And then that HTML tag or element, and an element is everything between the start tag and end tag, or the open tag and close tag. The HTML element here is said to have 2 children, head and body, respectively. The head tag, meanwhile, recall, has a title tag inside of it. So this is a child of this, or equivalently, this is a grandchild of that. You can model a family tree off of this same paradigm. But then lastly, this oval down here is the raw text that is the sole child of the title element. And this oval here, hello body, is the sole child of the body element here. Now, this is a very simple web page, and you could certainly imagine a more complicated web page having many more nodes and many more edges than these, but there's going to be a one-to-one correspondence between the text that's received by the browser and what's ultimately built up in memory. But they're equivalent, but it's worth noting that the indentation here is just for the benefit of really you and me and anyone else that might look at this code. Generally speaking, we'll see browsers don't care about white space, so to speak. All of this pretty indentation and this pretty printing, so to speak, is really just for the benefit of the human reader, not the computer. But drawn as such, it also makes clear hierarchically what is a descendant of what in this case. So we have HTML at left, and we have the DOM, or document object model, here at right. So where does this HTML go? We'll recall from last time when we were implementing the internet that we looked ultimately at the format of URLs in our discussion of HTTP. And in these URLs, which might begin with a scheme of HTTPS, where the S indicates secure, / www.example.com, which might be the fully qualified domain name in which some website lives, well, we typically would have more than just that at the end of the URL. Not necessarily. If you have nothing at the end of the URL, it implies that you want the default homepage of the New York Times website or any other. In this case, though, we've explicitly noted that we would like specifically to access from the server a file called file.html. Now, it could be called anything. In fact, a default name is commonly index.html, but we've called this one file.html to make clear that it's indeed literally a file on some server, specifically at www.example.com out there on the World Wide Web. So what is inside of file.html? Well, not surprisingly, it's actual HTML. So the convention for naming files that contain HTML is to end them with a file extension of .html, sometimes .htm, depending on the server that you're using. But nowadays, it's not even necessary technologically for URLs to end with .html. You can actually hide the file extension altogether via any number of techniques. But here in this case, we're going to keep it simple and literally use .html files to make clear their contents. In fact, let's go ahead and pull up VS Code or Visual Studio Code and create a file containing exactly those contents we saw a moment ago. So here in VS Code, I've got the same setup that you might recall from our discussion of Python. At the moment, it's preloaded with a bunch of files I created in advance so that we have some examples ultimately to work through. I'm going to go ahead and simplify my interface a little bit, though, and hide my activity bar at left. And for now, I'm going to go ahead and hide my File Explorer so that all we're left with here is my terminal along the bottom of the screen, and then room for some code tabs or editors along the top. And what I'm going to do, as we did with Python, is run the command code, which is simply VS Code's way of creating a new file. And I'm going to specify code of hello.html. Now, I'm going to go ahead just to give us a little more room and hide my terminal window, but it will eventually be back. And I'm going to go ahead and code up my very first HTML page. Now, again, I'm not programming per se, but I am writing code. It's just that HTML, as we'll see, does not have the same kinds of features that Python had, like functions and loops and conditionals and the like. We'll see that HTML is indeed a markup language that describes the data inside of the document. It doesn't provide you with programmatic control. However, toward the end of this lecture, we'll be introducing an actual programming language called JavaScript, which will give us back some of that same functionality. All right, here we go. In a file called hello.html, I'm going to do open bracket, exclamation point, doc type, space, HTML, close bracket, so to speak. Going to give myself a couple of blank lines. And now I'm going to say open bracket, HTML, lang equals en, since that's what this particular web page will be in. You'll notice that somehow magically /HTML appeared on its own inside of angled brackets too. That's just because VS Code, as a text editor, and also like an integrated development environment in IDE, is trying to save me time by trying to anticipate where we're going with this and auto-completing some of my thoughts. I'm going to go ahead then and hit Enter. And you'll also notice that the cursor has been automatically indented, just as with Python, 4 spaces, because it's presuming that I'm going to want to put something inside of this element called HTML. All right, let me go ahead and open another tag, the head tag. It too was just auto-completed, so I'll hit Enter to move my cursor down. I'm going to go ahead now and do open bracket title, close bracket. And then inside of the title element, I'm going to do hello, comma, title, as before. I'm going to manually move my cursor down below the close tag for the head element here. And now I'm going to open up a new tag, open bracket, body, close bracket, and then move my cursor down, and in there do hello, comma, body. So at this point in the story, all I've done is recreate exactly the file that we saw on the screen earlier. So it's going to automatically save. So it'd be nice to now look at this web page. But how? Well, at the moment, because I'm using a cloud-based version of VS Code, I'm already using a web server somewhere on the internet. However, that web server, by default, like most web servers, is running on some common TCP ports, namely 80 and 443 for HTTP and HTTPS respectively. Therefore, I can't really view my file at that same URL because that URL is what's providing me with the cloud-based version of VS Code. But herein lies the value of those same TCP ports. Even though this might be unconventional, it's actually very commonly done when implementing websites as a developer, you can use really most any other TCP port you want just temporarily while developing your site so that you can serve up web pages really on your own private web server using the same physical server, but on a different TCP port, which is precisely the point of having on the outside of those virtual envelopes specific port numbers per services. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and open up my terminal window again. The last thing I ran, recall, was code of hello.html. And notice at the moment that for today's class, I've revealed a second tab in my terminal window. This one is specific to the cloud-based environment I'm using. Port 1337 happens to be in use already, and that's a TCP port that this cloud-based environment is already using. But what I'm going to do is go back to my terminal, and I'm going to go ahead now and run http-server. And then enter. And we're going to see a whole bunch of output on the screen, followed by a prompt to open in browser your application running on port 8080. So by convention, I've chosen 8080 as the TCP port that I want to use. I'm going to click open in browser, and you'll see now a listing of all of the files in my account in the cloud. Now, there's way more files than I just created because I literally created just one file. All of these other files are the ones that I prepared in advance of class so that we can walk through some pre-made examples just to save on some keystrokes. But down here is indeed hello.html, which is the file I just created among all of these others. So what you're seeing here is a directory index, so to speak, a listing of all of the files in my cloud account. However, you're seeing them hosted on a different TCP port, specifically 8080. And in fact, if I go back to my other browser tab, in which VS Code still is, you'll see under the ports tab next to my terminal that, not only is port 1337 open, so is port 8080. Now, this is not a detail that you'll necessarily see on your own Mac or PC if using VS Code on your own Mac or PC. But if you do use a cloud-based programming environment like this, which is increasingly common, you'll find something very similar to this exact setup. And indeed, for this particular course, you'll see precisely this setup, unless, again, you decide to use locally VS Code on your own Mac or PC. But for now, what I'm going to go ahead and do is go back to my terminal window. I'm going to create a second terminal window, in fact, by clicking this plus icon, just so that I can leave that command http-server running really in perpetuity, because I want to constantly, during this class, be able to pull up web pages that I've created. But I've got a second terminal now that I can still type commands at, like code, when I want to open or create other files. All right, so let's now go ahead back to my second browser tab where I see the directory listing of everything in my folder. I'm going to click specifically on hello.html. And while you might not be that impressed by what we just made, it at least is, in fact, my very first page on the World Wide Web. Here, of course, is hello, body. And indeed, as promised, the body is like most of the web page itself. But here's that title in the tab here, hello, title. So we see both, we have both, and this file now is available on the World Wide Web itself, but not quite publicly. One of the tricks here using this cloud-based environment is that only I currently am authorized to view this page. So even if you were to copy paste the actual URL at which this file lives, only if I click some buttons and make it fully public could anyone access it. But that's fine, because now we're in the development phase. I'm not actually ready to push this to production, so to speak, at a nice user-friendly URL instead. So at this point, we have a web page that does actually work. It's actually been served up. What more can we do with HTML? Because this certainly isn't all that inspiring yet. But indeed, any page you visit on the internet nowadays looks a little something like this, even though it probably has many more tags and many more attributes. In fact, why don't we take a tour through some of the possibilities? Let me go ahead and close hello.html. Let me go ahead and open up a file I created in advance called paragraphs.html, which looks a little something like this. I'm going to hide my terminal window just so that we can see a bit more of it. And you'll see that at the top of the file, as before, we have our document type declaration. This time, on line 3, we actually have a comment I wrote in advance just to remind you and me what this file is meant to demonstrate. And we have here demonstrates paragraphs. All right, well, what does that mean? Well, it turns out in HTML, if you want to have paragraphs of text, you have to convey as much to the browser. You can't just write a paragraph, hit enter, write another paragraph, hit enter, write another paragraph, hit enter. You actually need to introduce some tags into your web page that effectively tells the browser, hey, browser, here comes the start of a paragraph then your paragraph. Hey, browser, that's it for my paragraph. Hey, browser, here comes another paragraph, then your second paragraph. Hey, browser, that's it for my second paragraph. So we're going to have more open and close tags. And indeed, that's exactly what we have. Below the HTML tag, which is the same, with the same lang attribute. Below the head tag and title tag, we have the body. And then inside of the body, notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, and perhaps more paragraphs as well. Now, these paragraphs don't actually say anything, even though they look like Latin. This is lorem ipsum text, so it's just been generated to look a little something like Latin, just to fill up some space. And it actually is so long, each of these paragraphs, that it sort of wraps past the end of the screen. But notice here, we have open bracket p close bracket, which is short for paragraph. Then we have almost the same here, open bracket / p close bracket, which again just means to close the previous open tag as well. And that repeats with different paragraphs of text. So what actually does this look like? Well, let's go over to our second browser tab. I'm going to hit the back button so we can go back to that directory listing, which has every file therein. Let me scroll down to the one in question here called paragraphs.html. And voila, there are our paragraphs of text, albeit nonsensically. Here, though, we do have some paragraph breaks. You'll see the white gaps vertically between each of those paragraphs. And that is because the browser knows about the p tag for making paragraphs and formatting them in this way. Now, just for kicks, what if I had omitted those paragraphs and I had just done things the sort of old-fashioned way by hitting enter a couple of times? So let me remove this tag and these tags 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 and this tag, such that now I have what seems to be a whole bunch of paragraphs of text. And I'll make as much clear by even hitting enter after each of them to give them some white space vertically. If I now go back to paragraphs.html, it actually looks great still, but this file has already been downloaded from my web server, so it's cached, so to speak, saved in memory. This is why I now have to hit the reload button, or Control R or Command R, to reload the page from the server so that my browser downloads a fresh copy thereof. So to be clear, even though I have two tabs open in the same browser, my first tab is VS Code somewhere in the cloud. My second tab represents the browser trying to access files from that cloud-based server. So here we go. If I go ahead and click my browser's reload icon, now it's just one big blob of text. All of those paragraph breaks seem to have disappeared altogether. So suffice it to say, I need those paragraph breaks explicitly. So I'm going to undo all of those changes we just made, which is to say that HTML at the end of the day is pretty pedantic when it comes to prescribing how you represent your data using this markup language. All right. Well, what else can we do? Well, in addition to these paragraphs of text, it would be nice if we could format the document a little more beautifully, maybe have some chapter headings and some section headings, some subsection headings and the like you might see in a paper or in a book. Well, we can do that as well. Let me go ahead and close this tab here and open up my terminal window again. Let me go ahead and open up this time a file called headings.html and introduce a few more tags as well. Let me open that file, close my terminal window. We'll see some familiar tags already. Document type declaration, HTML, head, title, body, and now some new ones. Above my first paragraph of Latin-like text, I've got what looks to be a h1 tag, and then a close h1 tag, then an h2 and an h2. And if I keep going, I bet I'm going to see one or more as well. So these h1, h2 tags, and so forth represent headings tags. And what they tell the browser to do is to format whatever word or words are between them big and bold, but maybe a little less big and bold, a little less big and bold. Ironically, the bigger the number gets. So h1 is the biggest and boldest. h6, it turns out, is still bold, but much smaller. So in fact, if I scroll down, we'll see that there's not only h1, h2, h3, h4, 5, and 6 above each of these paragraphs. So let's go back to my other tab here. Click the back button so as to go back to my directory index. And in this case, let me scroll up to headings.html and see the result. Here now we have what looks like a more beautifully formatted book or chapter or paper or the like, where the browser is automatically handling all of the formatting thereof. Now, what if you don't like the font? What if you don't like the font size, the bold facing? All of that is changeable, albeit using different techniques. For now, we're really focusing on just marking up the contents of the page, the actual words here, be they in English, Latin, or really anything else. All right, what else can we do? Well, it's very common nowadays on websites to have lists, for instance, of information. So let's go into another file here. Let me close this tab here, open up my terminal, and open up a file called list0, which is the first of my lists. I'll close my terminal window again. And this page is actually quite simple. It still has the familiar document type declaration, HTML, head, title, and body tags, but then a little something different. It's got a UL tag and a close UL tag, then a whole bunch of pairs of LI tags here. Open and close, open, close, open, close. Foobar and baz, these are just sort of verbal placeholders for computer scientists, much like a mathematician might reach for X's and Y's and Z's. Computer scientists, when they just need placeholder words that don't really mean anything, they go with foo, bar, baz, and then a bunch of others as well. So this is just a list of 3 words that happen to be foo, bar, and baz. Well, what kind of list is this? Well, you'll note that UL here indicates that it's UL here has 3 children, LI, 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 each of which is closed. So this is going to be a list of size 3. But what kind of list? Well, let's take a look. Let me go into my other browser tab. Click back to go to my directory index. Let me go ahead and open up, in this case, list0.html. And so quite simply, it's a bulleted list, something you might get in Microsoft Word or Google Docs or the like. It's just a bulleted list, really an unordered list, unordered in the sense that there's no numbers here. It does go from top to bottom, but there's no numeric indices associated with any of these list items because UL stands for unordered list. Well, how can we change this? Well, your mind might be going where mine is here. I can go ahead and close this tab, open another, open up a file now called list1.html, which is my second version because, as before, we'll start counting from 0. And if I now reveal the contents of this one, it looks almost the same, except that we have an OL tag opened and closed instead of UL. So whereas UL was unordered list, OL is ordered list. So in fact, if I go back to this tab here, click back, open up list1.html, same exact words, but automatically numbered. All right, so what's the value of this? After all, I could have just used a bulleted list using UL, and I could have myself just manually said 1 period, 2 period, 3 period, and made my own darn list. But here's just one of the features of HTML. It stands to reason that you might eventually have, in some web page, longer lists than this. You might want to go in after the fact and add some elements in the middle, at the beginning, and the end. And if nothing else, it would just be annoying to have to manually renumber everything. This is one of the reasons why computers are so valuable. They can do all of this automatically for us. The browser itself can probably use some kind of for loop or while loop and start numbering these things top to bottom for me without me having to worry about hard coding those numbers myself into my HTML. So here we have then an ordered list where the browser does more of that heavy lifting for us. All right, well, what more can we do with HTML using some more tags in our file? Well, let me go ahead and open up another file here called phonebook0. We, of course, have searched a phone book for such names as these. And in fact, if I hide my terminal window here, we're going to see all of a sudden a lot more HTML. But it's not very complicated. You just have to add to your vocabulary a few more tags. And with it, you can now structure data in tabular form with rows and columns. So we got the same old tags up here. But then the things get interesting inside the body, whereby we have a table tag. Then a little less obviously, we have a T-head tag, which stands for table head. So this might be the first row of the table that maybe looks a little different. Maybe it's bold-faced or allows for sorting or something like that down the line. TR, even less obvious, but this stands for table row. And then TH, just as succinctly, stands for table heading. So specifically, even though this reads top to bottom a little weird, this says, hey, browser, here comes a table. Hey, browser, here comes the head of the table. Hey, browser, here comes a row in the table. What are the columns within that row? Well, implicitly, the first column will have a heading of name. The second column will have a heading of number. Why first and second? Well, because they appear in the HTML in this order. So the browser is going to infer that if it sees one TH tag and then another, top to bottom, it's going to lay out these columns by default from left to right. Hey, browser, that's it for the table head. Hey, browser, here comes the table body. Let me scroll up a little so we can see more of the body here. And we'll see inside of the table body here a whole bunch more of table rows represented by the tr element again and again and again. And so what's inside of this table body? Hey, browser, here comes a table row. The table data, TD for short, should be Brian in the first column and then TD in the second column, this phone number here. Same thing for David, same thing for Doug, same thing for Eric. And then John seems to have a slightly different phone number if you'd like to give him a call or text sometime. But ultimately, after this, I think you can probably guess what's just off screen. If John's row has just begun and has 2 table datas, yep, there is the close table row. There is the closed table body. There is the closed table, the closed body, and the closed HTML. So this example has a lot more tags, but it's only because there's so many more components to this page, a whole bunch of rows and columns inside of which are what we might call, in the world of spreadsheets, individual cells. Now, it's a little strange to think about your rows and columns in this indented HTML format. So let's go back to my other browser tab. Let's go back into my directory index. Let's open up phonebook0.html, and there we have it. It's not the prettiest table to look at, but the table heading has been bold-faced automatically by my browser for me, thanks to those TH tags. And then I do have a column of names and a column of numbers, thanks to all of those TRs and TD tags therein that give me this simple phone book here. All right. So that's just more HTML tags. And we'll start to speed through some more and more of these tags, because really all we're doing is trying to build out a vocabulary. We have yet really to introduce any new ideas. We still have our tags. We still have our attributes. Here now we're just seeing some more examples thereof. But the web pages we've made thus far are fairly textual in nature. Why don't we see if we can't go ahead and create something a little more graphical? So I'm going to go back into my first tab in VS Code and close this phonebook0.html. I'm going to open up my terminal window again, and I'm going to open up, this time, image.html, and then close my terminal thereafter. In this page, which is fairly short, we have a description of what's coming, demonstrates images. Well, how do we do this? Well, inside of the body of the page, I've got an image tag, img for short. I then have a source attribute, src for short, equals quote unquote bridge.png, which apparently is the name of a file inside of my cloud account here that presumably is in the exact same folder as image.html, because this is what we would call like a relative URL or relative path, in that there's nothing before it, no mention of folders, no mention of another domain name or scheme. So this is presumed, therefore, to be in the exact same folder as the file that mentions it. Now, this is the first example where we've seen an HTML element that has not just one, but 2 attributes. In this case, we have not only source, which is going to be the source of the image, that file there. We have alternative text, ALT for short, which is good for accessibility, which is good for slow connections. Why? Well, for instance, someone with a screen reader on their computer could actually have these words, Harvard University, read aloud to them by that software. And indeed, if you're on a slow connection and the image hasn't quite downloaded yet, you can at least see the words Harvard University before you actually see what I would imagine is going to be a photograph of a bridge at Harvard. So let's see this in action. Let me go back to my second browser tab here. Click back to go back into my directory index. Let me go ahead and open up image.html. And sure enough, there is what looks like a bridge. In fact, I haven't actually properly resized this for the size of this laptop. So I can go ahead and zoom out here. And now we see the entirety of this image. It's not really cropped in a way that looks very beautiful yet, but that's because I haven't really done any manipulation of it. I've just told the browser, hey, browser, here comes an image. Plop, bridge.png there. Well, notice, too, what's interesting about this image tag. If I go back into VS Code here, notice there's a subtle difference between the image tag and every tag thus far. Something's missing. Like, what seems to be off? I mean, thus far, every tag we've used seems to be symmetric in some sense, whereby if I open the tag, I then close the tag. If I start the tag, I then end the tag at some point. But the image tag, notice, has no corresponding close tag. I don't see open bracket / img close bracket. But that's actually OK, because it turns out, just sort of semantically, like an image can't really start at one point and then eventually end. Like the image is either there or it's not. So it would be sort of silly if you had to close the image tag. Certainly it would be weird if you started the image tag here and then like closed it later on down there, because how could you put something in the middle of the image? You can't. That's just not possible by design. So it turns out that there are some empty elements in HTML, which is to say they don't require a close tag. Now, there are variants of HTML that actually do have you specify a close tag nonetheless, or put a slash inside of those angled brackets nonetheless, but that's not necessary. And in fact, we'll keep it simple and omit those unnecessary syntactic details and just claim that the image tag can stand alone in this way. So it's a little bit different from everything else thus far. Notice, as an aside, that when we've closed all of these tags, we do ignore the corresponding attributes. So for instance, this only applies to one example, but we have it again in this example here. Notice that the HTML tag indeed has an attribute, lang equals quote unquote en, but we have never mentioned that attribute or value again down below because it's just not necessary. When you close the tag, you do so only on the basis of its name, and the browser will realize by symmetry here that, oh, this tag lines up with this one up here. Now, another word, though, on these attributes, to tie it together to discussions past. This lang is the attribute. This en is its value. By convention, we've got double quotes. You could use single quotes if you prefer, especially if there's words in the value with spaces therein. But this is just another example of key value pairs. And we've seen this before in our dictionaries. We've seen this before in Python and data structures more broadly, this notion of key value pairs. HTML's approach to key value pairs is in the form of these attributes and their value. So here, too, there's not really a new idea. It's just incarnated here with a slightly different syntax than we've seen before. All right. Well, what more can we do besides images? Well, we might as well throw a video into the mix. So let me go ahead and close this tab here. Let me go ahead and open up now a file called video0.html. And in this file, we'll see quite simply how we might go about embedding a video in a page, like this one here, video.mp4 for MPEG-4. How is this done? Well, there's a video tag, much like there's an image tag. But in this case, it's video spelled out completely, whereas image is just img. Notice here are some additional attributes, and these two are curious. It turns out with some HTML attributes, they don't need to have values. The mere presence of the attributes' names themselves is sufficient to coerce the browser to behave a little differently. And you might infer what these two attributes do. Controls just means that I want to see like a play icon and a pause icon and maybe some other controls on top of this video when embedded in the web page. Muted means exactly that. I don't want this video to play automatically. This is probably a good thing when it comes to browsers nowadays, which typically don't play videos automatically, even if you want them to, if they're going to play sound, if only because that's a bad UX, a bad user experience, and tends to be used by advertisements. But in this case, we can at least try to ensure that the video is not going to bother anyone, even though they might click play. It's not going to play sound by default. Meanwhile, the source of this video, and this is spelled out actually as source, not as src, weirdly, the source tag does have an src attribute, but the value of that is video.mp4. And the type of this video, for clarity, is video/mp4. And this is what's generally known as a MIME type. And this is just a standardized string of text that describes what type of file is inside of the actual file being downloaded, in case it's not completely clear from the file extension alone. So how else might we embed videos? Well, besides this video here, and I'll leave it to you as an at-home exercise to open up this actual video and play it perhaps with sound, let me go into my terminal window again. Let me open up video1.html just to show you an alternative way of embedding videos, which is so common today because of the omnipresence of YouTube. If you were to go to a video on YouTube and click the share button or similar, odds are you would be able to navigate your way to a little bit of HTML code that you can then copy and paste into your own files. For instance, that's exactly what I've done here. It's a little long because it's wrapping off the screen there, but notice that I copied and pasted this exact line from YouTube. It's a tag called iframe, which is a frame inside of the web page itself. The width of it, based on YouTube's suggestion, is 560 pixels across by 315 pixels down, though I could resize that, ideally proportionally. The source of this particular iframe or embedded video will be this long URL here. And if I keep scrolling, there's going to be even more attributes here, some of which are a little specific to YouTube's own features, including an allow attribute and the values therein that YouTube has suggested, a refer policy, allow full screen, and perhaps more. So in short, this is an incredibly common paradigm when visiting a website that has certain types of media, like a video, to copy paste some recommended HTML into your own website so that you can therefore embed it in your own. Now, you shouldn't be in the habit, though, of just copying and pasting blindly any code that someone tells you to embed in your site, because you can actually accidentally inject perhaps even malware, malicious software into your site. Not so much if it's an iframe like this, most likely depending on your settings, but if it's in fact a chunk of JavaScript code, more on that in a bit, which could actually change aspects of your page that you don't actually intend. So I would beware when doing this, but it is nonetheless a feature, and a popular feature at that. And I'll leave this one too as an at-home exercise if you'd like to open up in your browser video1.html and see how the video embeds. Of course, the most common feature of web pages are probably hyperlinks, or links themselves. So how can we go about creating some HTML that allows the user to click on a word on the page and then be whisked away to some other page altogether? Well, let's go ahead and do this. Let me go back into my terminal window here after closing video1.html. Let me open up link0.html, and let's see what's inside. Well, here we have a relatively simple web page that introduces just one new tag down here, A for anchor, followed by an attribute of href equals quote unquote, for instance, image.html. In other words, if my goal is to create a page that has a hyperlink, or link for short, from this page to another, such that when you click on that link, it takes you from the former to latter, I can use this anchor tag with an href attribute whose value is the page or even full URL that I want to take the user to. Then outside of that tag, I can specify the name of the link itself, what I want the human to see, and then I can close the anchor tag like this. Ideally, the tag would have been called the link tag, but it turns out the link tag was used ultimately for something else. But A is anchor for short, and indeed is among the most common tags you might see in a page. So let's go ahead and see the results here. If I go back into my second tab and click back, this time now, if I go into link0.html, I'll see exactly that. Visit Harvard with the link underlined. And if I visited before, which I frequently have, it will show up in purple by default instead of in blue. But if I click on this link, you'll see that I'm whisked away to that same file as before, earlier, image.html. Now, if I go back again, notice this. If I hover over this link, you'll often see in the bottom corner of your web browser exactly the link to which you'll be sent. This alone is a feature because, unfortunately, even the simplicity of this link tag lends itself to what are generally called phishing attacks, whereby you might be misled into following a link that looks like it goes one place, but actually goes to another. For instance, here, instead of linking from one web page to another, I could link to a full URL like https://www.harvard.edu. What the user would see, of course, is still the word Harvard, but where they'd be linked to is the full URL. But there's nothing stopping me as a web developer from going in there and saying, you might think you're going to Harvard, but you're actually going to go to Yale instead. And only if you hover over the link, or actually go to it and see where you end up, will you know that even the word Harvard might link you to a different place altogether. And indeed, phishing attacks take advantage of this dichotomy between what you see and where you go to potentially mislead people into thinking that they're going to Harvard or even harvard.edu, but actually they're going to a different destination altogether. Now, it's not necessarily the case that all URLs are going to be of this form. In fact, I dare say it's more common to see URLs that look a little more like this, where you don't see an explicit file name, but instead you see some kind of path followed by a question mark, and then one or more key value pairs, the key and value of which are separated by an equal sign. And in fact, if there's two or more, you would then have an ampersand and then the second key and value respectively, and that process can repeat for longer and longer URLs. This, in fact, is how, using HTTP, a browser can provide input to a server that goes beyond merely requesting a specific page or path on the server. In other words, if a user were to fill out a form with their name and email address, maybe some checkboxes, credit card number, or password or the like, when that user hits enter or clicks the submit button, all of those key value pairs, the name and the actual person's name, the email field and the actual value they type in, can be passed to the server inside of the URL itself after this question mark. In fact, we can see this ourselves with a bit of HTML of our own. Let me go over to VS Code here, open up my terminal window again, and this time open up search0.html. This, too, is not a large file, but it does introduce a few more tags and attributes as well. In fact, inside of the body of this page, we have now a form tag, which has two attributes, one of which is action, the other of which is method. Now, in reverse order, the value of method here seems to be quote unquote get. Recall that get was the operative word we saw earlier in our representative HTTP request, where the browser wants to get, literally, some web page on the server. This indicates to the server that it's indeed going to use that same get method or verb. Action here, albeit cryptically named, means where do you want to get data from? Well, in this case, the value of the action attribute. Specifically, what I'm aspiring to do with this example is implementing my own version of Google. I'm not going to get into the back end thereof and the database and all of the web pages. I'm just going to implement the so-called front end of google.com, namely the search page. And so if unfamiliar, this notion of front end and back end is a very common paradigm in computing, whereby the front end is everything that the user sees, the user interface really, and the back end is everything the user doesn't see. It's the server, the code on the server, the data, the database on the server that is nonetheless driving the front end, but not something the user can directly see. Now, what's inside of this form element in between its open and close tags? Well, we have two input tags. And notice these input tags themselves have a couple of attributes. Name equals quote unquote Q. That is to say, this input is going to be like a little text box. And I know it's text because of the second attribute, whose type equals text. And the name of this text box is going to be Q. And I know to use Q simply because for all of these years, Google.com, thanks to Larry and Sergey back in the day, decided to standardize the name of their text box as Q, short for query. So if I want to implement my own front end for Google, I have to adhere to their same standard. So I'm giving my text box a name of quote unquote Q. Meanwhile, the second input here is of a different type, namely a submit button. So the mere fact that I've typed type equals quote unquote submit is going to turn this second input for this form into a clickable button instead. And the value of that button, that is the label on it, is going to be Google search. So let's see the end result here. If I go back into VS Code and open up my other tab, click back to go back to my directory index, and then scroll down to search0.html, I'll see the simplest of web interfaces, namely a big text box and then followed by a button, Google search. But what's powerful here now is if I click in this text box, type in a word like cats, if I'd like to search for cats, notice what happens to my URL. If I zoom in at the top here, you'll see that I'm currently inside of a file called search0.html. Or rather, that is the file I've requested from the server and the browser has rendered. As soon as I click this button here, Google search, watch what happens up top. All of a sudden, the URL in the browser changes to https://www.google.com/search, which, recall, was the value of the action attribute of my form tag. Meanwhile, if we go back to the second tab and again zoom in up here, you'll see that following /search, the so-called path on the server, is a question mark, which says, hey, server, here come the key value pairs, otherwise known as HTTP parameters. The first of which is Q, the value of which is cats. And that's why I see here the Wikipedia page for cat, and if I scroll down, even more search results about cats. Now, if I go back here to search0.html, you'll see that this isn't the most user-friendly form. In fact, if I want to search for something else, I have to, again, click in the box and delete, delete, delete to get rid of everything I've typed. But it turns out there are even more types of inputs than text and submit. In fact, I can change quote unquote text to quote unquote search, because it turns out browsers today know that sometimes you want search boxes to be useful for search forms like this one here, which themselves might come with a specific feature. In fact, let me go back to my directory listing, go into search1.html, in which I made that same change. And now you'll see when I click in this box and type in something like cats, the simplest of enhancements, a little X that I can click that will just delete the whole thing at once. And that's a feature that comes from simply using a different value for that same type attribute. I can do more things here. In fact, let me go back into VS Code here, close search 0, open up not search 1, which we just saw in action, but search 2.html, and you'll see a few more attributes on one of these inputs. For my first input here, which notice still has a name of Q, this time, though, a type of search, notice that I've added a few other attributes as well. Autocomplete equals quote unquote off. A moment ago, you might have seen a little black popover that indicated that I had previously searched for cats. And so my browser was trying to autocomplete my subsequent queries starting with C, but this will turn that feature off. Autofocus, which doesn't actually need a value and therefore no equal sign after it, indicates that I want the browser to automatically focus on this text box, which literally means move the cursor automatically into that text box so that I don't force users to have to grab their mouse or trackpad and click on that specific text box. Meanwhile, placeholder is yet another attribute that the input tag supports, which puts little grayed out text inside of the text box before you start typing into it to help you know what it is you're supposed to type into that box. So nothing fundamentally game-changing here, but all of these minor enhancements that do ultimately, I claim, yield a better user experience, or UX. Let me go back to my other tab here. Let me go back to my directory index, and this time open up search2.html. And again, fairly minor enhancements, but creating a better experience for the users and therefore less friction for interacting with my site. I can see query in gray, which I can type over and type in cats. The little X still pops up because this is a search box. But notice as I start deleting cats or start typing something else that starts with C, I don't get the attempted autocomplete, which might just mean there's less clutter on the screen. It's a little more private for my users because subsequent users aren't going to see literally in this same text box at least what others have typed. So minor enhancements that nonetheless yield a better result. And in fact, it is just so common on so many websites nowadays not to have little refinements like these. But it really is as easy as this with HTML alone to maybe add some attributes or change the value thereof just to improve the experience for your users and or, say, customers. Well, what else can we do besides this? Well, it turns out, especially when collecting input from users, you can specify the format in which you want that data. For instance, you might want a text box specifically to contain someone's email address, which of course follows a standard format, including an @ and maybe some dots. You might also want to collect someone's phone number, which in the United States might have some dashes or perhaps some parentheses or more, formatting those digits. Well, it turns out in HTML and also in many other languages like Python, like JavaScript and beyond, you have support for what are called regular expressions, which are quite simply patterns that you can validate against or in some cases even use to extract portions of information. So there are admittedly a little advanced, and the syntax is a little weird and takes some practicing and, frankly, Googling sometimes to remember what to do with them. But these regular expressions, otherwise known as regexes, support syntax like this. If you want to depict a pattern that you want the browser to validate the user's input against, you can do something like this. You can say dot, which means any old character. You don't care what, but at least a character there. You can say star after something like the dot, which actually says 0 or more of that previous thing. Or if you want at least one, you can say dot plus, which means 1 or more characters. And not necessarily the same character, but just 1 or more characters again and again. If you literally only want 0 of those characters or 1, you can use a question mark instead. If you know exactly how many characters you want, you can use curly braces in a regular expression and then a value n for number, which specifies that you might want 3 or say 4 digits in some space specifically. Or you can put a lower and upper bound on the same. And there's yet other syntax too with which you can express patterns like these. Meanwhile, you can also express ranges of numbers that you want to allow, or even letters as well, inside of these square brackets, so to speak. Meanwhile, you can specify ranges of numbers. If you don't want to type out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you can do 0-9 to emphasize that range. Or more succinctly, you can say \lowercase d, which means any decimal digit, or \uppercase d, which means any character that is not a digit, that is the opposite. In fact, let's put some of these patterns to the test. Let me go back here into VS Code. Let me close our previous search example and open my terminal. Open up this time, say, register0.html. And after closing my terminal, we have a relatively simple page here, which contains, again, a form. This time, though, it doesn't have an action or method because I don't actually care at the moment about submitting this form anywhere. But I do have an input tag here. Autocomplete is off. Autofocus is on. The name of this text box shall be phone. And the pattern to which the user's input must adhere is apparently this. And before I spell it out, consider what this might represent based on what we've seen. Backslash lowercase d meant any digit, 0 through 9. Curly braces 3 means give me 3 such digits, not necessarily the same, but any 3 digits. Then give me literally a hyphen. Then give me 3 more digits, not necessarily the same. Then give me literally a hyphen. Then give me 4 digits. And at least in the United States, this is one way of formatting a number. Number, 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 dash, number, 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 dash, number, 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 number. 10 digits in total, formatted exactly like this. The rest of this line is familiar. If I scroll to the right here, the placeholder that I chose to give this particular input is just a visual cue to the user as to what format I expect. Meanwhile, below that, I have an alternative to an input element that had a type equals submit value. It turns out nowadays you can also have button elements that don't even need a type equals submit attribute and value if you intend for that button to be used in the same way. So the end result of this, if I now go back to my other browser tab, go back into my directory index and open register.html, is a very similar form, but one that's prompting me to type in an actual number. But here's the rub. If I don't cooperate here and type in a number in precisely that format, and instead I do something silly and nonsensical like type in cat, if I try now to submit this form, even though there's no action attribute, so who knows where it's going to go, I click register, my browser will admonish me, the user, saying, please match the requested format. Now, this is just referring back to, of course, the placeholder value I have here, or I could maybe describe it somewhere else in the page, but you're gaining a little bit of client-side validation now as a result. Rather than relying on the user just to hopefully cooperate, the browser can, at least to some extent, enforce the same. Now, what if, by contrast, we wanted to collect not a phone number but an email address? Well, we can do that too. Let me go back into VS Code, open my terminal, open up register1.html, and reveal this. And this is a rough attempt at a pattern or regular expression for email addresses down here. Pattern equals, quote unquote, the following. Dot plus, which means one or more character. Doesn't matter what character or characters, but I need at least one character and maybe more. Then literally an @ sign. Then dot plus, which again means one or more characters, whatever they are. Then in this case, a backslash dot. And this is a little weird, but backslash is often used to escape characters that might otherwise have some special meaning. So in this case, backslash dot means no. I don't mean any one character, which up until now that dot or period has represented. I mean literally a period right here, a dot in the email address. So this is a way of reversing the effects of having standardized on a dot representing sort of a wildcard character. When you want literally a dot, you got to undo that meaning by using, in this case, a backslash. And then the implication here is that I only want to accept email addresses that end in .edu. Now, it turns out this is only a rough attempt at an email address validation. Turns out email addresses are much more complicated than this and might actually have more characters to standardize. But this is a rough attempt at the same. So in fact, if I go into this version in my other browser tab, going back into my directory index and opening up register1.html, and suppose I'm a little lazy and I just type Malan at Harvard and click register, well, there too, I'm going to be admonished to match the requested format, which ideally I would spell out in a placeholder value or perhaps in some text elsewhere on the screen. Now, it turns out I don't need to figure out what the pattern is for an email address, especially if it's such a common scenario. So in fact, let me go back to VS Code here, open my terminal, and open the last version of register, register2.html. And you'll see you don't even need sometimes to use patterns if they're just common paradigms that you want to validate against. I can just change the type of this input from text, say, to email, quote unquote. Now, what does this give me? Well, it means that the browser will automatically use this regular expression, which I dare say is incredibly hard to read and probably impossible to memorize, but baked into browsers nowadays is this or similar regular expression that's more complicated than we'll spend time on here. But this just kind of hints at how sophisticated email address validation can be and why it's in fact best then to leave it to the browser and not necessarily your own patterns. That is not to say that regular expressions are not useful and powerful, but you don't necessarily have to resort to them. In fact, when there's common cases like emails as well, you can use some built-in functionality. But there is a catch here. And in fact, let me go back into register1.html, which is requiring that I provide a specific format of email. I'm going to go ahead and reload the page just to clear out that form and point out that client-side validation, like I've been here preaching, is really not sufficient. Why? What have I done? Well, it turns out that by adding these attributes to, say, the input tag, I'm telling the browser that you should validate this against this pattern and prevent submission of the form. But the problem fundamentally with web pages is when a browser requests one from a server, they download effectively the contents of that HTML into the browser's memory or RAM, where they maintain their own local copy or cache thereof. At that point, though, all bets are off. The user who has accessed that web page and has downloaded it effectively to their own Mac, PC, or phone is certainly free to change that HTML if they so choose. And if they have the technical savvy, it's not all that hard to do so. In fact, it's so easy because browsers today typically have built into them what generally are called developer tools. That is, features that you and I, as typical users, might not necessarily know about, care about, or use. But software developers, web developers, might actually use these quite heavily. So what do I mean? Well, for instance, if I go back to VS Code here and open up my second tab after that, where I have the register1.html page, you might know already that you can do any number of things by right-clicking or control-clicking on a page. For instance, in this case, I'm using Chrome. I can open up this context menu here and choose any number of menu options like View Page Source, which on your own browser might be called a little something different. Now, this is just a view of the HTML that's been downloaded into the browser. And in fact, you can do this on any web page. If you go to NewYorkTimes.com or anything else on the web, you can probably right-click or control-click somewhere on the page, not on a link, but maybe on some part of the background, find a menu option similar to View Page Source, and see something quite like this. And odds are, if you actually go to a real website like New York Times or the like, you're going to see dozens, if not hundreds, of lines of HTML and more that compose a much more sophisticated web page than mine. But this does, in fact, give me a view of the web page that at the moment is not editable. This is just a copy of my page that I've downloaded, just if it's interesting to see. But notice, too, if I close this view source, I right-click or control-click again on this register1.html web page, and this time I go to inspect. Now I've opened up full-fledged developer tools where I have even more functionality at my disposal. On the left-hand side here, I can see all of the elements in this web page, indeed under the Elements tab. And out over there, I have even more features that we might tinker with. Now, these are all collapsed hierarchically just to make them more readable on the screen. Let me go ahead and zoom in on the bottom left of my screen under Elements, and notice that I can expand the little triangle next to Head. And I can see, oh, what the title of the page is. I can then expand the little triangle next to Body, and I can see what's in there, a form, which I can click on again and then see everything therein. Which is to say, you can see what pattern is being used inside of the HTML that composes this page. But I could change that, or really anything else. Let's do something innocuous. Let me go ahead and zoom out first and zoom in at the top. And you'll notice that my Register tab is indeed called Register. Why? Because in the title of this page, at bottom left, if I zoom in again, the word inside of the title tag is indeed register. Well, what if I want to do something a little malicious here, or maybe just playful? I can actually click on this element here and change the text in between open tag, close tag, title. For instance, if I want to really excitedly welcome the user, I'll add a single exclamation point and then save it. And if I go back up to the tab here, you'll see that I've actually changed the title in this here tab. All right, well, that's not such a big deal. But recall that a moment ago, if I tried to register with something like Malan at Harvard, which is not a valid address, the web page would not let me. However, if I go down to the elements here and I click on this, I can, if I want, just highlight that pattern, delete it altogether, save the new HTML, and now that client-side validation is completely gone. Which is to say, if I now click register, I am not going to be warned by the browser. Now, we won't really see an interesting effect here because, again, I don't have an action value, so I'm not going to send this form to any interesting site. But if I were to click on the register button now, it would not care what value I've typed in. I could do Malan at Harvard. I could use a .com address, .net address, .uk address, or anything else. The pattern now is no longer in place. Now, I could conversely make the form better, and I could change the text here at the end and say type equals email. And now the browser will enforce the email type. But no normal user is going to do this. But malicious users might very well change your HTML within their browsers to circumvent these client-side validations. Now, they're not hacking into your server because your HTML is still saved somewhere safely in the cloud, presumably on some server. However, again, when a browser visits a website via its URL, it gets a copy of that HTML in its own memory. In fact, it's loaded into that tree structure that we described earlier as a DOM. But the browser, and in turn the human controlling the browser, can certainly tinker with that HTML if they want, removing any of these validations. So on the one hand, these client-side validations, like these patterns, wonderfully useful because the browser then can give immediate feedback to the user that they've typed something wrong, thereby decreasing the probability that they're going to put invalid data or incomplete data into your server or database if they're submitting this form to you. The downside, though, is that while it does improve the usability of the site, the user friendliness of the site, it is not a sufficient defense against maliciousness, whereby a user could remove all of these things altogether, submit bogus, invalid, incomplete data for your server, and you're not going to be the wiser unless you have also implemented on your server using Python or some other server-side language that receives that web form some other conditional checks or patterns that make sure that no data is going into our database unless it is validated here in duplicate server side. So client-side validation is great for usability, for user experience, but it is not good or sufficient for security. You'll still need server-side validation, which might very well mean writing a bit of code in duplicate in some other language to do the same. Though increasingly nowadays, there are libraries, third-party code that someone has written that helps you generate validating code for both the client and the server. One more tool that's worth knowing, not only your own browser's tools, but this URL here, validator.w3.org, is a simple but useful website into which you can actually copy and paste HTML that you've written in order to validate its correctness. That is to say, to make sure that all of your tags that have been opened have been closed, that all of the tags that you've written are in the right place, and so forth. It can help you suss out security vulnerabilities like we discussed just a moment ago between client and server-side validation, but it can at least ensure that your HTML is correct as written and not therefore syntactically invalid in some way. But with HTML alone, all we have is the ability to structure our data in web pages into the head, to the body, and everything therein, to actually now begin to stylize things by changing formatting and font sizes and colors and more. We need yet another language, which we'll soon see is called CSS for cascading style sheets. Let's take a short break, though, and return with this second of our 3 languages today. All right, so CSS, cascading style sheets, another language that also is not a programming language insofar as we're not going to see loops and conditionals and the like as before, but it's the language we're going to use to stylize our web page. So HTML, hypertext markup language, gives us the structure of the page and the layout. CSS takes things the final mile, so to speak, and stylizes the fonts and the spacings and all of that. So how can we use this? Well, let's deploy it first to make a very simple home page, for instance, for someone like John Harvard. And I mean very simple, but we'll progressively make it a little better and better, focusing ultimately, though, not on the features of CSS, but the fundamental ideas underlying it. So let me go back into VS Code here. Let me close my developer tools from before, go back into VS Code itself, close register2.html where we left off, open my terminal, and starting fresh in my terminal, let's go ahead and code up a new file called home.html to represent a home page for John Harvard. This first one I'll do manually as before. And what I think I'm going to prepare is something that looks like this. First, let me go ahead and close my terminal and my file explorer, focusing entirely on home.html. Open bracket, exclamation point, doc type HTML. my document type declaration, which again just reminds the browser that we're using HTML version 5. Then below that, open bracket HTML. The language of this page shall again be English. Notice that VS Code is auto-completing that first thought. The head of this web page is going to contain a title. The title of this page shall quite simply for now be home. And then below the head, I'll start my body. And inside of the body of this page, let's do sort of 3 paragraphs of text, keeping things simple. Maybe a header of the page that's just going to have John Harvard's name. So let's do open bracket P for paragraph. Then let's go ahead and inside of that put John Harvard's name. Below that, let's create another paragraph so that the middle of the page says something friendly like, welcome to my home page. Then below that, a third and final paragraph, a footer of sorts for the page that says something like copyright, and then we'll put a little C symbol in parentheses, John Harvard. All right, so a very simple web page, not all that much to it. Let's go back to my second browser tab and go back to my directory listing. Let me in here go to home.html, and you'll see a very simple page with 3 paragraphs, if you will, but they're not really paragraphs of text. It's really 3 chunks of text, 3 regions of the page. But let's start to make them a little interesting, right? Like maybe I should have the top of the page, John Harvard, be a large font, because it is, after all, his home page, and I'd like to center it. Maybe the welcome to my home page could be a little smaller, so like medium-sized text, and also centered. And then the footer, which is less interesting, we should probably make that a little smaller, if centered as well. So let me go back into home.html. And thus far, we haven't really seen mechanisms for styling the page. We did see our heading tags, H1 through H6, but that was just sort of big and bold on down. But we can be more refined now. Much like a word processor like Microsoft Word or Google Docs, we can be much more specific with our aesthetics. And in fact, I'm going to do this as follows with CSS. CSS is a language that essentially consists of properties. And properties, funny enough, are just key value pairs by yet another name. In HTML, we have attributes and their values. In CSS, we have properties and their values. Now, there are multiple ways to specify what tags you want to apply properties to, and we'll see now a few examples thereof, specifically by introducing a style attribute to my HTML. Let's go back to VS Code here and go into the first of those paragraphs. And if I want John Harvard's name to be in a large font and centered, here's how I can do that. I can add to my paragraph tag a style attribute with style equals quote unquote. And I'll finish the thought first and then move my cursor therein and say font dash size colon large semicolon. Then after that, I'll say text dash align colon center semicolon. Now, strictly speaking, the second of those semicolons is not necessary. You just need it to separate one property from another. But for symmetry, I'll use it in both places. Meanwhile, let's notice the format here. We have a key and a value separated by a colon. We then, after a semicolon, have another key and value. So in this case, we have 2 key value pairs. That is to say, 2 properties associated with this particular paragraph tag. Now, let's go ahead and do something similar but different for the second of these paragraphs. Let's add a style attribute here. This time say font size medium, semicolon, but text align, colon center, and semicolon. Then down here on the last of these paragraph tags, let's add another style attribute here. Font dash size, colon small, semicolon, text align, colon center, quote unquote. Now, what is large, medium, and small? Well, in this case, it's left to the browser to interpret those relative to each other. But I could, with CSS, use other units of measure. I could use pixels for dots on the screen, or I can use points, with which you might be familiar in a typical word processing program. But to keep this a little bit simpler, I'm just going to simply genericize things as large, medium, and small, and let the browser decide what it means by each of those values. Notice, though, that I've text aligned in the center all 3 of these paragraphs. So let's take a look. In my other tab now, if I go back into home.html and click reload, because again, I've made changes on the server, but my browser doesn't yet have a copy of those changes, but will when I reload. Now I have in the center of the page everything, including a slightly larger John Harvard, a medium welcome to my home page, and then a smaller copyright down at the bottom. All right, so what more can I do here? Well, a minor refinement first. It turns out that I don't have to mimic the idea of a copyright symbol. It turns out that I could type that somehow on my keyboard, but even if I can't on, say, my US English keyboard here very easily, turns out HTML also supports, as an aside, what are called entities, which are numeric codes that represent certain symbols that might otherwise be difficult to type on a keyboard unless you copy and paste them from some other resource or use some menu that provides them. So in fact, I'm going to go ahead and just as a minor change here, change this copyright symbol to be this pattern of characters. Ampersand, hash symbol, 169, semicolon. Thereby giving this page what's called an HTML entity. VS Code, just to be user-friendly, is color coding it. That is syntax highlighting it to stand out from everything else. But that pattern, ampersand, hash, 169, semicolon, it turns out, if I go back to this page here, and now notice, focusing your eyes on that lower line, now it's a proper copyright symbol now that I've reloaded the page. That aside, let's now consider the structure of this actual web page. I don't really like semantically that I went with these p tags or paragraphs, because these aren't really paragraphs of text. It's, again, just sort of 3 regions of text. Well, it turns out there are more generic tags that you might use when you want to convey to the browser that, yes, you want a different chunk of text here, but it's not necessarily a paragraph in, say, the English grammatical sense. So what I'm going to do here is make a change to home.html, and I'm going to change all of my p tags to div tags instead, where div stands for division, thereby giving me a different division or region of the page. So I'm going to open and close each of those div tags accordingly, but make no other changes. In fact, if I go back to home.html and reload, at this point we'll see that actually some of that white space has gone away, because to be helpful, the browser has assumed that if you do have paragraphs of text, like in a book or a paper, you probably do want a little bit of that white space between them. But in this case, if you've just got 3 divisions of the page, it's probably sufficient just to sandwich them together and leave it to me using CSS to maybe add more padding or margin, so to speak, down the line. But let's consider for a moment what is poorly designed about what I've done here thus far. I think this is an improvement, a step forward, to move away from paragraphs, which they weren't really, to these divisions of the page. But notice that there's a bit of redundancy. And if you think back to our time with something like Python, we generally try to avoid repeating ourselves for any number of reasons, not the least of which was accidental mistakes that might get copied and pasted, or just making it more time consuming to make changes later if we have to do it in multiple spots. Now, I don't like the fact that I'm seeing text-align center, text-align center, text-align center 3 times. At least with font size, it was changing the value each time. But can we maybe factor that out somehow? Well, here's the C in CSS. Cascading style sheet essentially alludes to the capability with CSS for styles, or properties specifically, to cascade down onto children and grandchildren and descendant elements more generally. Wouldn't it be nice then to maybe factor out text-align center to the parent of all 3 of these sibling div elements by moving it to body? And that I can do. So let me go back to my editor here, and let me, for the moment, go ahead and delete all of this text-align center from the first of those elements, from the second of these elements, and from the third of these elements. And I can keep or delete the semicolon. At this point, there's only 1 property in each of those quoted values, so they're not strictly necessary. But I can now go back and add to the body tag a new style attribute, quote unquote, text-align center here. And insofar as body is the parent of div, div, and div, that style will cascade down onto each of those descendants and ensure that all of them will be centered. In fact, let's go back to my other browser tab. Let me click reload. And a bit underwhelmingly, nothing seems to have changed. But I would argue that not only is this just as correct, it is now better designed. Because I have factored out that commonality. I can now change it in one place. If I want to change center to left or to right, I can in one place. I don't have to worry about copy paste or unnecessary characters in that there file. All right, well, what more can I do next? Well, it turns out that this isn't necessarily the best practice to put your CSS inside of your HTML and commingle it in this way. It's just often frowned upon from a design perspective, if only because it means that now I cannot maybe separate these concerns. I, for instance, one employee can't work on the HTML and have another employee, a colleague of mine, who's maybe more artistically inclined, work on the CSS, because everything's very commingled in the same file, which tends not to yield good results, at least if you're working exactly in parallel. So what if we could factor out further all of this CSS, maybe to some common location that's separated from the actual HTML? Now, I'll do this, but here in technology, it actually turns out that with some context of code, it's actually not all that uncommon to commingle CSS and HTML in this way, particularly when making apps. So these are different design paradigms, and we'll see both of these ways. Here we've combined them, but let's move towards something separate. Let me go ahead now and delete all of these style attributes that I've created thus far, and move all of those properties to a different location altogether. In fact, look at the HTML now. It looks much tighter. It's much more obvious that we have div, 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 and the contents thereof. Let's put those same properties elsewhere. And this is going to be my first opportunity to go back into the head of the web page, and in addition to the title, now add not a style attribute, but a full-fledged style tag. Open and close. And inside of that open and close tag, what I'm going to do now is specify, using some CSS selectors, the names of some elements or perhaps other designations that allow me to associate properties with specific tags later in the HTML. For instance, if I want to apply one or more properties to the body, I'm going to type inside of this style open and close tag the word body, followed by an open curly brace, which VS Code is going to autocomplete for me. And I'm going to go ahead and hit enter just to move it to a new line. And then inside of those curly braces, I'm going to do something like this: text align center. Meanwhile, I'm going to specify how I want to style those other divs. Now, I could say something like this: div, open curly brace, and then inside of this say something like font size : but wait a minute, I have 3 divs, and I want one of them to be large, one of them to be small, and the other one to be medium. So at this point, it's not sufficient to use a so-called type selector, the type of the element, the name of the element, div in this case, to associate properties with it, because this property would associate with all of those same divs. So I need to be a little more specific. So what I can do is actually use an ID selector instead. In other words, I can invent a word that makes sense to me, and I can say something like this: hash header, and then specify that the header of this page shall have a font size of large. And then down here, I might say hash footer, and then inside of its curly braces, I might say the font size there is small. Now I can use these identifiers in my HTML as follows. I can go into this div and add not a style attribute, but a new attribute called ID, and give this div a unique ID of header. And I can give this last div a unique ID of footer. And while I could give this middle div a unique ID of its own, because it's in the middle and it's just medium text, I could also be a little clever here. And I could just say, you know what, by default, the font size for this web page shall be medium unless some other selector overrides that default value. So now let's scroll down and see that I'm using header and footer in just one place each. And indeed, that's the definition of an ID. It must be a unique ID used just once in your HTML. But in this way, I think I've associated one or more properties with the header and footer respectively, as well as with the body more generally. So let's take a look. Let's go back into our other tab, which currently looks like this. But when I reload all of those changes, it looks exactly the same. So we have just another way now of designing this, even though it appears unchanged visually. But here's too where we can tinker with some of those same developer tools. On this web page, let me right click or control click, choose inspect to open up developer tools, and you'll see at bottom left the head of the web page, the style tag therein. And if I scroll down, I can see the body of the web page and all 3 of my divs. Notice though at right, which is convenient now, I see in this same Elements tab, not just the HTML, but also the CSS properties that apply to that element. In fact, notice here a mention of body and a mention of font size medium and text align center. That means that because I'm hovering over the body element right now, this property indeed applies accordingly to give it those 2 property values. Meanwhile, there's something italicized down here, which is browser specific. My browser is telling me that by default, it's going to have a margin of 8 pixels around the body of the page, and it's going to display everything in block form. But more on that another time. Meanwhile, there's some placeholder here where I could manually add some styles. And in fact, just for fun, this is where you don't necessarily have to go back and forth between VS Code and your browser tab. You could start tinkering with other elements here. For instance, I could change the color of this page to be red just by adding a color : red property. And my browser, Chrome in this case, is giving me a little square to make clear to me what red actually means. And notice that the web page actually changed. But I'm not changing it on the server. Again, just like when we tinkered with developer tools to tinker with the patterns and regular expressions, if I reload this page, I'm going to get the same original HTML, and all of those temporary modifications went away. So again, this is developer tools in the sense that it's useful for me, the developer, maybe just to do some rapid prototyping and changes and see those results. But notice what I can also do here is if I go into the body here, highlight the header, you'll see that not only does the body feature get inherited, it will specify for you in developer tools that the font size medium is no longer applicable. It's been struck through. Why? Because higher up we have an ID selector, hash header, that indicates indeed that the font size should actually be large. But notice what happens if subtly in the page. This checkbox is just part of these developer tools. If I want to see what the page looks like if I turn off font size large, notice you can click on that and watch the top of the page. John Harvard's name just got smaller. That is, it became medium. If I check it again, it becomes large as well. So in short, underneath the hood of your browser up until now have been some very powerful features. And if you choose to explore more HTML and now CSS, there's a lot of ways to do this within your own browser and even see how other web pages, yours, maybe your competition's web page, is implemented by just understanding the layout and values for their HTML, CSS, and more. All right. Well, what more can we do here? Well, it turns out that we don't necessarily need to invent these IDs ourselves. It turns out increasingly that the web is becoming more and more semantic. That is to say, within the newest version of HTML, there are more and more tags that themselves have meaning. So we're beginning to move away from using divs and divs and divs. And there's a similar tag called span, which doesn't give you a division of the page, but a smaller span thereof. Divs can be replaced in this case with tags that have more meaning to the browsers themselves. And you can't invent your own words necessarily, but there are, and if you read the documentation for HTML, any website, take a course, or read a book, you'll find that there are many more tags than we're even seeing here today. What I can do, in fact, is this. Let me move away from using these ID selectors and instead change this first div to literally a header tag, which is not my prerogative per se, but it does in fact exist, so that's why I can do this. Meanwhile, I can change this div down here to be footer, and down here I can close the same tag. Now I could leave this middle element as a div, but turns out there's another one that might be more appropriate, namely it's called main. So now I have semantically 3 areas of my page: the header, the main part, and the footer. Now why is this useful? Well, for something called SEO, search engine optimization, it's probably useful to inform the Googles and the Bings and the others of the world that when it comes to crawling this web page, that is downloading it automatically and loading it into their database so that other users can search for it subsequently, it's probably useful to tell them that, hey, these words here are part of the header of the page, which is probably important. It's probably what you want to see in the search results as a preview. The main part of the page is where the really juicy content is, and the footer probably is less important, and so maybe we don't have to worry about searching over the footer as well. This might be useful for screen readers as well, for accessibility. If someone with a screen reader wanted the software to recite verbally the contents of the page, it can probably forego the footer, at least initially, and maybe even the header, focusing on the main part of the page or other semantic clues like that. So just as with the alt tag, we have now the alt attribute, we have semantic tags that you would know from reading documentation for HTML that just are good, better and better, not only for users, but also the crawlers, the search engines out there that try to make sense of what's herein. So how do I change this? Well, I can go back to a so-called type selector, and instead of using the hash symbol, which is just shorthand notation for unique ID, I can change this to literally footer and literally header. And heck, if I want now, I can add a main clause for my main tag, for my main element, saying something like font size medium, if I choose not to instead have it cascade from the body on down across everything. So that's just yet another way to do this, and I'm sure we could come up with infinitely many others as well. Now there's just one catch with this approach too, is that we've seen thus far now type selectors, where we're specifying in our CSS the names of our tags. We've seen ID selectors, and it turns out there's something where you can select based on attributes and their values, but we'll focus lastly for now on class selectors instead. The downside of the approach I've taken here is that these attributes, text align and font size, apply only to these tags, or previously only to those unique identifiers. What if, though, I wanted to have reusable sets of properties that I can use in 2, 3, 4, 300 locations in my page or website? Well, I can define classes instead myself. So how might I do this? Well, let me go ahead and delete all of these properties and start fresh inside of this style element. If I want to create a set of properties that generally will center my text, I can use a dot, which means in this case, I can specify the name of a class, so to speak. Inside of that, I can specify the one or more properties that mean centered in my mind. So I'll say text align colon center. Now, below that, I might define another class called large. So that too starts with a dot. The dot just means, hey, browser, here comes a class name. And then inside of these curly braces, I can say something like font size colon large. Then I might do, say, dot medium. Inside of there, font size colon medium. Below that, I might do dot small. And inside of that, font size colon small. The only difference here fundamentally is that now I have created reusable classes, descriptions that I can use in multiple places on multiple tags without having to worry that the tag is itself unique, as was required for an ID selector. So if I scroll down here, what I can now do is say, all right, if I want the header to be large, I can add that class. And I can say class equals large. Down here on main, I can say class equals quote unquote medium. Down here, I can say class equals quote unquote small for the footer. Moreover, if I want to center all of those elements too, I can actually put two class names inside of the quotes separated by a space. For instance, I can say centered small. I can say centered medium, and I can say centered large. Or conversely, I can say large centered, medium centered, small centered. The order doesn't matter, but in this case, I've used the common word first. Now, this at a glance might already strike you as suboptimal. Why? Because I'm repeating myself, seemingly unnecessary. So let me actually undo that and delete all mentions of centered and go with where your mind's probably going, which is to factor that out too. Put it on the body and say class equals quote unquote centered, and that will have the effect of now centering the entire body of the page. If I now go back to my second tab, I'll close developer tools at this point and just reload the page. We should be exactly the same visual, but underneath the hood, I've created now some classes that are reusable. But they're reusable at the moment only within this file. I think we can take this one step further and indeed enable collaboration across colleagues and company as follows. Let me go back into VS Code. Let me scroll up here to my style element. Let me highlight and cut, that is, remove all of that content, including the style tags themselves. Let me open my terminal window and code a file called home.css. This time, the file extension .css indicates that the contents of this file are going to be stylizations, that is, properties. Let me go ahead and open that file, close my terminal, paste what I just cut. Let me go ahead and highlight it and just de-indent it so that all I have in home.css is exactly the same CSS as before, but it's all left aligned and just nicely displayed in this file. Then I'm going to go back to home.html, which is still open. I no longer have a style tab, but I'm going to add one other tag instead in the head. I'm going to have a link tag, which has an href attribute, which links to home.css, quote unquote, and the relationship of that file to this one is going to be that of style sheet, quote unquote. Now, even though link implies that this is a link, like a clickable link, that's not what we mean. We're simply creating a link between this page and home CSS because the relationship is style sheet. The browser will know when it downloads home.html to automatically download home.css as well because of this line of code here. And then the browser will automatically apply the styles, that is the properties in home.css, to everything here in home.html. So here again, we can go back to the home tab, reload, see nothing different because it still just works, but is arguably now better designed because if I go back into VS Code now and using some kind of server or service, I bet I could continue working on home.html. A colleague of mine, it can work on home.css. We can bring the two together and make a more beautiful web page having worked on them in parallel. You know what? Now that we have all of these more building blocks with CSS, let's go back to a previous example and see if we can stylize it a little bit further. Let me go back to VS Code here. I'm going to go ahead and close home.css and home.html. And I'm going to open up a file that I made in advance, this one called link2.html. I'll close my terminal window and reveal what this file looks like, which has, as before, the same HTML down below. Inside of the body, we have visit Harvard with a link surrounding it. But notice now we have inside of our style tag a little bit of CSS that's adding some more color. In fact, I've chosen to specify the following properties for any anchor tag or link tag in this page. Color :red, which we've seen before, but this time text decoration none, which we'll see removes the default underline of any given link. Then down here we have what's called a pseudo selector, whereby I'm saying whenever you see an A tag that the user is hovering over, as with their cursor, go ahead and temporarily change the text decoration to an underline. So this is a neat use of CSS to create almost an animation of sorts, but just by using these key value pairs. In fact, let me go back now to my browser in my second tab and click back. Let's go ahead and open up link2.html, and we'll see visit Harvard. And indeed, the word Harvard now is colored in red, but there's no underline, even though I do think it's a link. But as I move my cursor over the word Harvard and hover over it, that so-called pseudo selector kicks in, :hover, because it's on this A tag, and the browser knows to now underline and call attention to this same text. So again, using just a bit of CSS knowledge, some properties, these key value pairs, whether you store those key value pairs inside of the HTML itself, or as we've just seen in another file altogether, we now have the ability to make our web pages all the more stylized as well as structured. Let's do one more thing. Let me go back into VS Code here, and let me open up the previous example, phonebook, but this time a second version thereof. Let me run code of phonebook1.html. The first one was phonebook0.html. Close my terminal window, and here you'll see that I've done just a little something different. I've added, yes, a link tag, which we've just seen before, but with a seemingly unfamiliar URL mentioning something called Bootstrap. Well, it turns out that one of the greatest upsides of using a language like CSS to stylize your web page is that you can make use of what are generally called frameworks, otherwise known as libraries, whereby someone else has written, in this case, a whole bunch of CSS properties, save them into files of their own somewhere at a URL on the web that you can automatically incorporate into your own projects in order to stylize your web pages without having to write all of those styles yourself. Now, it's a library in the sense that it's indeed third-party code that someone else wrote. In this case, it happens to be open source and freely available to you and me. But a framework further tends to just govern how you use the features thereof. You have to design your files in such a way that you adhere to the documentation provided in that there library. So a framework is a way of doing something, a way of using some library. And in this case, the library in question happens to be a popular one known as Bootstrap, which can be included in your own project simply by having a link tag with an href attribute that points to an appropriate URL, which I've copied and pasted from their own documentation. Moreover, insofar as this is a framework and I need to adhere to some of their conventions to use their code, I have added a few things. On my table tag for my phone book, I've added class equals quote unquote table. Seems a little strange because it's obviously already a table tag, but this class called table, as per Bootstrap's own documentation, is what tells the browser to apply Bootstrap's table stylization to what was previously a very boring looking phone book. Moreover, down here, I've added scope equals quote unquote call for column, just to specify that name and number respectively refer to the columns of data below them. But I know that only from having read the documentation, and in this file is a huge number of key value pairs, a huge number of properties that someone else wrote that I can now use, having read their documentation, by just choosing the right classes. So not only does defining classes in CSS help me and my own colleagues factor out some of our common work, collaborate more readily, it also allows us to stand on the shoulders of others, incorporate third-party code into our own so as to not have to spend as much time reinventing the wheel, like creating menus and buttons and forms and all of that, including the aesthetics of tables. So let me go back into my second tab here, click back into my directory index, open up this time phonebook0.html as before, which recall looked quite simply like this, which was the browser's own default stylization thereof. Now let me go back And by having just added that link tag, that class, and those scopes, my same exact HTML is now stylized as follows. Now, it might not really wow you, but I dare say this is much prettier to look at than the example we've already seen. And if I were to dig deeper into Bootstrap's own documentation, I could start to colorize this by adding colors. I could stripe it by making every other row a different column just to make things more visually apparent. So many features come with these frameworks, whether it's Bootstrap or any other. And indeed, this is just one of the upsides now of having tools like HTML and CSS at your disposal. But up until now, our content has been fairly static. Once we download the page, what you see is what you get, and it's only interactive insofar as you might be able to interact with a form and send information elsewhere. But what if we want to keep the user on our same page and make our web pages more interactive themselves? Well, for that, we need a third and final language, this one called JavaScript. Let's take a short break and return with a look at just that. So JavaScript, the third of our 3 languages today, and this one is a proper programming language. It's got functions and conditionals and loops and more, and it's a language that's commonly used within web pages to control dynamically the contents of and the experience for the user. So in the case of JavaScript, what we effectively have is the ability to take this HTML, which recall is loaded into memory as a so-called DOM, document object model, by the browser. We have the ability with JavaScript to make changes to this DOM in real time. In other words, we can access data therein. We can add new nodes, remove nodes. We can change the contents of the page. And you actually see JavaScript in use all over the place. For instance, if you use Gmail or Outlook and you just sit there watching your inbox, odds are on some schedule you'll see new mail. And then new mail, if someone's indeed sent you new mail. And that's without having to click reload on the page to reload the entire page's contents. Rather, your browser, behind the scenes, is running a bit of code, a bit of JavaScript code, that essentially in a loop or some form is just constantly checking with the server, have I gotten more mail? Have I gotten more mail? And if so, it updates the contents of the page. And now I don't exactly know how Google and Microsoft have implemented the HTML of their inbox, but I could imagine, insofar as the emails are usually shown as rows and rows and rows of mail, that maybe it's a table of some sort. And so using JavaScript, what Google and Microsoft might do in Gmail and Outlook respectively, is just add more TR elements, more TR elements, more TR elements to a DOM like this after your initial inbox has loaded. Let's take a look at then some actual examples of JavaScript by introducing a final tag, the script tag, into some of our pages. Well, let me go back here into VS Code, and let me go ahead and close the phonebook1.html with which we ended, open up my terminal window, clear it, and then open up hello1.html, which I propose shall be the second version of our very first page, hello.html. Let me go ahead and close my terminal window now, scroll down to the bottom, and we'll see in the body of this page, you can see a few new details. Well, we still have a form, as we've seen in some of our examples, but we seem to have an onSubmit attribute here, the value of which looks a little bit like Python code. But in this case, it's indeed JavaScript code, a different language altogether. We have some familiar input tags down below, but notice that there's mention of what looks like a function called greet. Now, this is not a function that comes with JavaScript. It's one that I wrote. So in fact, if I scroll up to the top of this page, you'll see that between a new script tag, I have defined in JavaScript a function called greet. Now, the syntax isn't quite like Python. Recall that in Python, we had the def keyword for define, and we had slightly different syntax. In JavaScript, we have literally a function keyword that says, hey, browser, define a function called greet in this case. Then we have parentheses, which indicates that this is a function that does not take, it would seem, any arguments. Then we use curly braces to indicate the body of this function, the lines of code that should be executed. And the single line of code that should be executed, albeit a mouthful, is this. Call an alert function, which does come with JavaScript, then pass in an argument to that alert function as follows. Quote unquote, hello, comma, space. I'm using single quotes here, but I could in JavaScript use double quotes instead, but single quotes are, dare say, more common. I'm using the plus operator, which just like in Python is concatenation to join the string on the left with that on the right. Now here's that mouthful. Document.querySelector, quote unquote, hashname.value. So what does this mean? Well, JavaScript, among its features when used in a browser, gives you the ability to query the document for a specific node using a unique identifier to get at it or a name to get at it and then go get its value. So if we scroll back down here to the form, notice that there's an input here whose unique ID is quote unquote name, because as we'll see in a moment, this new and improved version of hello1.html has a text box in which the user can type their name. So we're not going to keep saying hello world. I want this thing to say hello David, for instance, or whoever is using it. So by giving this HTML element a unique ID that I could call anything, X, Y, Z, foo, bar, baz, name makes more sense if I'm trying to get the user's name, I can use the same syntax that we saw in CSS. So these languages are borrowing ideas from each other, it would seem. I can select with this query that node in the DOM and go in and get its value, whatever the human has typed in. And then notice that this form will return false, which is a convention for saying, hey, browser, even though the user might have clicked the submit button, don't actually try to submit this form to a server, like with an action attribute as we saw before. Rather, just return false and do nothing more after calling the greet function, thanks to this onSubmit attribute, which itself is new for us now. All right, let me go back into my second tab, go back from phonebook1.html, and this time go into hello1.html. And in hello1, we indeed have this text box and a submit button. I'm going to go ahead and type in my name, D-A-V-I-D. I'm going to click submit, and voila, albeit cryptically and not very aesthetically prettily, we have a pop-up that says hello David below what seems to be like the URL of my unique code space in the cloud, my unique instance of VS Code in the cloud. All right, well, that's one way of doing this, but let's see another. Let me go back into VS Code here. Let me close hello1.html and open up this time hello2.html instead. This one, notice, does a bit more of the lifting outside of the form element and entirely in the script tag. So just like with our discussion of CSS, we try to ultimately to factor out the CSS into a different location and better yet, eventually into a file. I've done the same here. There's no mention of onSubmit. There's no mention of greet. There's no mention of return false. It's just pure HTML. But up here, I'm using some fancier features of JavaScript now to do the following inside this script tag. I am saying document.addEventListener, which is just a function that comes with JavaScript in the context of browsers that adds what's called a listener, a function whose purpose in life is to wait for a certain thing to happen. What thing? DOM content loaded, which itself is a mouthful, but it kind of means what it says. When the DOM's content is loaded into memory, that is, once all of the HTML has been read, top to bottom, left to right, and that tree-like structure, the DOM, has been loaded into the browser's memory, then please call the following function. This function is anonymous in the sense that I haven't bothered giving it its name. That is OK, and you can do this in Python as well. But what matters is that everything in these curly braces is going to get executed when the DOM's content is loaded. What happens? Well, document.querySelector is that same function as before. This time, we're not using a unique ID per se. We're saying whatever form is in this web page, add another event listener, this time listening for the submission event. That is when the user clicks on the button or hits enter in the form. And then when that happens, call this function, which takes an argument called e for event. But that I know only from the documentation. What, though, should you do when the user submits that form? Well, call the alert function, which in the end is that thing that brought up the ugly but functional box. Concatenate with it the result of querying for the name field, just as before, and grabbing its value. And then, this is the equivalent of return false, e.preventDefault. And the capitalization here is important. Just means whatever this form does by default, like submit to a server elsewhere, nuh-uh, don't do that, because all I care about is greeting the user in this case. So more of a mouthful, and definitely cryptic, and not something you'll necessarily want to or have to write, but it just speaks to the functionality that we have here in the browser. Well, what more can we do instead? Well, I can go ahead now and maybe make a more interactive version of the same. Let me go back into my second tab. Let me go back into my directory listing. Let's skip over that last example, which functionally is the same, and go to hello3.html, which this time has no submit button. But when I type my name like D-A-V-I-D, it immediately edits the body of the web page. And as I start to delete it, my name goes away. And then it puts in a default value instead. Well, how might I do this? Well, if we go back into VS Code here, close hello2.html, and open up hello3.html, we'll see a slightly longer function that does the following. When the DOM's content has been loaded, call the following function? Well, first define a variable called input. And let is a keyword that very politely asks the browser to create a variable in memory called input, but I could call it anything I want. Set that equal to the result of querying for the input element in this page. And there's just one. That's why we saw the one text box. Then go ahead and for that input, listen for the key up event. So that's an event that's defined in JavaScript for browsers. That means when the finger comes up from the key, go ahead and call this function. Well, that function says define another variable called name, though I could call it anything I want. Set that equal to the result of calling query selector for the paragraph tag on the page. And we'll see that in just a moment. Then, if that input already has a value, we'll change the inner HTML of that element to equal hello, comma, and then input value. And I'm going to wave my hand at some of the syntax here, but suffice it to say the $sign, the curly braces, the backticks here all have special significance in JavaScript, but that effectively allows me to concatenate together hello and whatever the user has typed their name to be. Otherwise, if there is no input value, just say hello, comma, whoever you are. And that's what we saw when I deleted my whole name. What's neat about this example, if we go back to that tab, is if I open up my developer tools as we've done before, let's reload the page. Notice that when I expand the body here, we see the original contents of the page, including a form with a single text box, and it turns out an empty paragraph tag. If I go back indeed to hello3.html and scroll down, that's all that's in this page. I created a paragraph tag with nothing in it, but kind of as a placeholder for future text. Now, it's not really a paragraph of text. It's very short, but I could change it to a div or really any number of other things. But I went with paragraph for text here. If I go back now to this form, watch what happens in my developer tools at bottom left as I start typing here at top left. As I type D, A, V, I, D, the actual DOM of the page represented here under the Elements tab as dynamically changing HTML will change in real time. So let's see. Capital D, A, and you're not seeing anything yet, but notice what happened to the P tag. Now there's a little triangle to expand it. And indeed, there it is. Hello, comma, DA. Let's keep typing in the box. VID. And Chrome is flashing it just to draw my attention to the changes. This is the developer tools equivalent of watching the JavaScript code change that DOM, that tree, in memory. And the browser is constantly updating the same thanks to this JavaScript code. So with this example, with these examples, we've seen not only the submit event that might happen, but also the key up event that might happen, and any number of other things might happen too. And in fact, I can go here and do something even fancier. Let me go into hello4.html, open up that file here, and you'll see mention of some other features that come with today's browsers, including the ability to synthesize speech. And let me wave my hand at this code and propose that via a similar text box, passing the input from the user into this speech synthesis feature, I can now do something like the following. Let me go back into my directory index, open up hello4.html, close my developer tools, type in my name, and in this version, there's back a button. Let me click that, and we'll hear hello.
Hello, David.
To indeed my name, David, verbally as well. All right, well, what more can we do too? Well, let me propose that one other approach we can take is to stylize this text box that we saw earlier much more beautifully than that built-in alert function. In fact, the alert function is not really meant to be used to create user interfaces, if only because it's especially ugly to look at. However, using frameworks like Bootstrap, you have access to not only CSS classes and other features for CSS itself, but often JavaScript functionality as well with that CSS. So in fact, let me go ahead and open up in VS Code here, hello5.html, and we'll see in hello5.html with a wave of the hand mention of, as before, this long URL for Bootstrap, which gives me access via this link tag to its own CSS. And I'll wave my hand at the JavaScript code here, but I read the documentation therefore, and I created what's called a modal, a window that pops up on the screen and blocks the user typically from doing anything else until they close that same modal. And what you'll see now is arguably a prettier version of a pop-up than the one that came by default with that alert function. Let me go back to my other tab. Click back and open up now hello5.html. Page isn't much to look at yet, but when I type in DAVID and click submit, notice that the pop-up now is indeed stylized. It faded in, it dropped down, and using some HTML I embedded later on in that page, I have compelled the browser using Bootstrap's JavaScript functionality and its modal feature to give me something like this, which is really just a placeholder for a more interesting dialog window. But you see the familiar X and the close button, and you could imagine filling that window with most any other contents of interest. So beyond the events we've already seen, like submitting and key up, there's so many other events that happen in browsers. And indeed, with JavaScript in browsers, be it on a laptop or desktop or phone, there are so many different events you can listen for. And this is what's generally known as event-driven programming, where you write code that doesn't just start executing the moment the user logs in, but rather waits and waits and waits until something happens, a so-called event. So maybe something changes on the page, or the user clicks or drags. Maybe the key goes up or goes down. Maybe the mouse goes down or goes up. Maybe any number of other events happen, and a specific function is therefore called as soon as that event is heard. And using events like these, we can do so many interesting things as well. For instance, just for fun, let me go back into VS Code here. Let me open up a file that's called background.html. And in background.html, I have just a little more HTML and JavaScript in turn that allows me to change dynamically the colors of the web page. Let's see what it does first. In my other tab here, let me go into background.html, where we'll see 3 buttons, R, G, and B. And because I've written some JavaScript code that listens for clicks on each of these buttons and then changes the page's CSS to alter its background color, I'm integrating HTML, CSS, and JavaScript with this simple example. When you click red, you get red. When you click green, you get green. And when you click blue, you get blue. How? Well, let's look at the code here. And you'll notice at the top of the body, I have just 3 buttons, each with a unique ID, using HTML alone. But then below that, I have a script tag that does 3 things similarly. But first, I declare a variable called body that stores the return value of query selector looking for the body. So this is just a variable that points to the node in the DOM that represents the page's body alone. Then I use another query selector to select the unique identifier red and add to that input, that button, an event listener for click. So when the user clicks on the red button, what happens? I change the body's styles background color to quote unquote red. Now previously we saw color to change the color of text to something like red. Now we're seeing background color, which allows you to change the background color of something to red as well. The other chunks of code here are quite similar. I'm looking for green and setting to green, looking for blue and setting to blue. And here too, with our developer tools, we can see what's actually happening. Let me go back to my second tab here and reload. So we start with the white background. Let me right click or control click and open my developer tools. And now notice if I click on the body, at the moment there is no background color. But if I click on R for red, notice at bottom right that the background color of the element I've selected, that is body, has been changed to background-color. Now there is a dichotomy here whereby the CSS property is called background-color in all lowercase. But the code we just saw was called background color capital C in so-called camel case with a hump in the middle for the capital C. This is perhaps because the right hand was not talking to the left hand when these languages were designed. And insofar as CSS was using a hyphen, that's fine. But when it came time to control CSS with JavaScript, a hyphen, as you might imagine, like in Python, is also used for the subtraction symbol as well. And so to say background minus color makes no sense. So in JavaScript, the CSS equivalents are camel-cased, so to speak, by getting rid of the hyphen and capitalizing the second word instead. But in CSS alone, it's still with the dash, as we saw for something like font-size and something like text-align. Well, what more can we do? Well, here's an example in blink.html that brings back one of the few tags that has the distinction of having been deprecated, that is, eliminated from HTML. In this file, there's a function called blink that has the effect of turning the body of the page from visible to invisible, otherwise known as hidden, back and forth by using another function that comes with browsers today called window.setInterval that allows you to call any old function however frequently you'd like. This line here means call the blink function every 500 milliseconds or half a second. And every time that same function is called blink, it changes the visibility of the body to visible, hidden, visible, hidden. The effect then, if I go into my other tab, close my developer tools, and open Blink, is to bring back what started off in life as an actual HTML tag that was just so darn annoying and ugly in web pages around the world that it was indeed phased out. But we can bring it back with just a little bit of JavaScript code. Well, what more can we do? Well, how about as a final flourish, we implement some of our own autocomplete. Typically, when you go to a website like Google or Bing or the like and start typing characters, you'll see words that start with those characters automatically. Now, odds are those words are not coming entirely from the contents of the web page. They might be coming from a server or at least a file that's been downloaded in advance. So let me, in fact, go back to my directory index here, open up autocomplete, and here in this box we'll see query, but no button, because I'm going to be listening for some of those key presses such that if I type in C, and then A, and then T, and then S, in this case, I'll see all of the words that start with precisely those letters. If I back up, the bulleted list will get longer and longer, and if I search for instead maybe dogs, I'll see only those words that start with DOGS, and so forth. Now, where is that coming from? Let's go back to VS Code here, open my terminal, and open up lastly autocomplete.html. And in this file here, we'll see that I mentioned one file called large.js, which happens to be a really big file of JavaScript code that contains over 100,000 English words, alphabetically sorted and all lowercase. What's above that here is an empty unordered list, or UL, because that's where I want to put that bulleted list of search results once I've started searching for them. Meanwhile, in this code here, I have several lines of code that essentially search for the DOM's input element and find the value that the humans typed in. Then I use that to iterate over all of the words in the dictionary and look at whether a word starts with the characters the users typed in. And if so, I go ahead and concatenate onto a variable that I myself called HTML, a list item element, open and close tag containing that word. And then lastly, I update the inner HTML of that unordered list with precisely the HTML that I've generated. The end result then is precisely the user interface that you might see on Google or Bing or any other website that's auto-completing. All they are using is a bit of JavaScript code to dynamically search over some data and therefore dynamically update some CSS and or HTML in the page to render all of that data for you, the user. That then is how we might weave the web using these three languages like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, which are predominantly used in websites today, but increasingly are HTML, CSS, and JavaScript used in mobile applications as well. Moreover, JavaScript itself, even though we have ourselves used it client-side by creating .js files or .html files containing it that are then downloaded from the server by the browser into local memory, can also, as a language, be used server-side as well. Indeed, JavaScript can be used as an alternative to something like Python. But using these technologies, which dare say are not going anywhere anytime soon, can you compose all of today's websites, some of today's mobile applications? And even though we haven't looked at all of the tags and attributes and properties and functions that exist across these three languages, we have looked at all of the fundamentals on top of which you can build sites and applications of your own.